Chapter 5: Bourgeois and Socialist Democracy. Bourgeois democracy. The crucial phenomenon with which Marx and Engels tried to come to grips in their political writings on Britain, France, and Germany was the growth in power and autonomy of the state bureaucracy and the subordination of it to the elective assembly and judiciary. They witnessed the decline of the liberal form of the, quote, legal state, end quote, which in some countries had only a short-lived and precarious existence, and the rise of bureaucratic statism. Their critique was directed against the autonomy of the executive within the state, its interference in elections, its suppression of civil liberties, its corruption of democratic forms for thoroughly undemocratic ends, etc., and against the autonomy of the state from society. Marx and Engels saw the state bureaucracy as a, quote, appalling parasitic body, end quote, which in a country like France had come to, quote, choke all the pores, end quote, of society. Either the state bureaucracy ruled behind a thin veneer of democratic and legal forms, which the state bureaucracy turned increasingly into a, quote, democratic swindle, end quote, a, quote, democracy of unfreedom, end quote. For example, by granting civil liberties like freedom of speech with, quote, escape clauses, end quote, like, quote, except when it contravenes the public interest, end quote, which effectively withdraw the original freedom, or it ruled directly without even this democratic veneer, putting itself forward as the universal class above politics and class differences and representative of the nation as a whole. In opposition to the power of the bureaucracy, Marx and Engels fought for the dominance of the legislature and the judiciary over the executive. Quote, escape clauses, end quote, must be removed from civil liberties if rights to a free press, free assembly, free speech come into conflict with the needs of state, then too bad for the state. Parliament must assert its command over ministerial posts and break the grip of the executive over the cabinet. Judicial independence from the executive must be upheld. Marx attacked constitutional provisions which, quote, deprived the courts of law of their ancient right of canceling administrative decrees, end quote. Hal Draper recounts Marx's praise, written in 1859, for the Hessian Constitution of 1831, based on the grounds that, quote, there is no other constitution which restrains the power of the executive within limits so narrow, makes the administration more dependent on the legislature, and confides such a supreme control of the executive to the judicial benches, end quote. Marx paid tribute to the fact that, quote, the courts of law, empowered to decide definitively upon all acts of the executive, were rendered omnipotent, end quote. Real judicial independence meant, for Marx, independence from the bureaucracy. The sham judicial independence that was developing meant, in fact, subordination to the executive and domination over the popular legislature. The courts, instead of being empowered to cancel administrative decrees on behalf of the assembly, canceled the assembly's decisions on behalf of the administration. Instead of the judiciary being elected by the people or the legislature in order to serve as a counterweight to the executive, they were appointed by the executive to serve as a counterweight to the people and its legislature. Marx attacked the doctrine of the, quote, separation of powers, end quote, which he saw as a shoddy compromise between the legislature and the bureaucracy, the effect of which was to free the executive from popular control. Marx called for, quote, unity of power, end quote, in the representative assembly, and for the assembly to take the necessary steps to implement the unity of power in the representative assembly. Simplify the state administration, augment the state administration's accountability to representative bodies, reduce the army of officials as far as possible, upend the state administration's hierarchical structures of internal authority. Marx called for civil society to create organs of its own, independent of governmental power, and for the assembly to support the initiatives of civil society in order to integrate struggles to democratize the state with struggles over self-organization and self-activity outside the state. Representative democracy backed by the rule of law and bureaucratic government backed by administrative decree appeared to Marx as the two poles of bourgeois authority. Marx recognized representative democracy backed by the rule of law and the bureaucratic government backed by administrative decree as bourgeois forms of domination. His initial tendency to see the bureaucracy as a hangover from the absolutist state of the old order, a view derived from the French experience but entirely inapplicable in Britain, gave way to the realization that the development of bureaucracy is a thoroughly modern bourgeois phenomenon taking place in all bourgeois states. Either the old bureaucracy was, quote, bourgeoisified, end quote, as in France, or a bourgeois bureaucracy was built anew, as in Britain. But although representative democracy and bureaucratic government being illustrated by Bonapartism, were both bourgeois forms of state, representative democracy and bureaucratic government were different forms of bourgeois state. Marx reserved particularly biting criticism for those, quote, true socialists, end quote, who either ignored the differences or in reaction against the repressive policies carried out by the Republic of 1848 put their support either actively or passively behind Bonaparte's coup. The conclusion to be drawn from the sham liberties of the 1848 Republic was not that all political liberties are a sham, but that sham liberties must be turned into real liberties. The lesson to be drawn from the true socialist was that it is possible to The lesson to be drawn from the true socialist was that it is possible to be, quote, anti-capitalist, end quote, without being, quote, pro-proletarian, end quote. The proletariat needs political liberty both as means for their own social ends and as an end in itself. Political democracy, quote, puts entirely new weapons in the hands of the proletariat for the struggle against the bourgeoisie, end quote. Like freedom of the press and of association, end quote, obtains an entirely different status for the proletariat, a status as a recognized party, end quote. Socialist democracy. Marx's commitment to political liberty as an integral part of socialism was apparent not only in his criticism of authoritarian and bureaucratic forms of bourgeois state, but also in his conception of the form of authority appropriate to socialist societies led by the working class. Marx's views on socialist democracy have often been misinterpreted by Marxists who have either obscured the formal distinctions between bourgeois and socialist democracy, as if they expressed the same form of government, or overstated the gulf between them, as if socialist democracy were an entirely different breed of animal from socialist democracy's bourgeois counterpart. In fact, in Marx's writings, there was a strong thread of continuity between bourgeois and socialist democracy, even though he did not identify one with the other. Quote, equal right, end quote, Marx wrote in the passage from his critique of the Gotha program, which we have already cited, quote, is in principle bourgeois right. Equal right is a right of inequality in equal rights content, like any right, end quote. These words are a useful reminder of the limits of law to those who would idealize law as an unqualified good. They have, however, been used by other Marxists to dismiss law entirely as a bourgeois form of regulation, to write off law's claims to equality, and to look elsewhere for socialist forms of authority. How far this was from Marx's view should be evident from the immediate context within which these words were written. Even in a very advanced stage of socialism, when all labor is considered equal to any other labor, and when workers receive in wages an equivalent to the amount of labor they have contributed to the total social labor according to the principle, quote, each according to his or her labor, end quote, even then it would be necessary for regulation to take the legal form of protection of equal right. It is true that equal right would still entail inequality, since some people are more equipped to labor than others, and some have greater needs than others. It is true that, quote, unequal individuals, and they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable by an equal standard insofar as individuals are brought under an equal point of view, are taken from one definite side only, for instance, in the present case, are regarded only as workers, and nothing more is seen of them, everything else being ignored. End quote. It is further true that only when, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois right is crossed in its entirety, end quote, and when society inscribes on its, quote, and when, quote, society inscribes on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote, that the limits of human equality and individuality can be reached. In regarding the limits of bourgeois right, however, it should not be overlooked that Marx believed, quote, equal right, end quote, to be a necessity in so advanced a stage of socialism as one in which class inequalities had been abolished in their entirety. For Marx, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, was not a temporary hangover from capitalist society to be eradicated as soon as practicable, but a principle which was to govern socialist society until the point of its transformation into complete communism. In the period of transition, however, both the form and content of law would be changed. Labor and the means of consumption are the only commodities that can be exchanged, and the means of production have ceased to be commodities in private hands. Quote, here obviously the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of equal values. Content and form are changed, because under the altered circumstances no one can give anything except his labor, and because on the other hand nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. End quote. This passage poses a question. What forms will law take in socialist society, and what will be the content of its regulations? Marx provides no clear answer, but he has said enough to show that, in his view, law in some form or other is a vital part of the transition to communism. The more general question of which this is part was that of analyzing the forms of authority appropriate for the emancipation of labor, just as classical jurisprudence had in its time analyzed the forms of authority appropriate to the emancipation of private property. But their methods were different. What was crucial for Marx was to start with a historical analysis of capitalist society and to uncover the social dynamics latent within capitalist society, not to start with natural law and deduce forms of authority from natural law. Analysis of existing forms of law and state revealed to Marx that it was not sufficient for the proletariat merely to take over this apparatus and use this apparatus for the proletariat's own ends. Why not? Because capitalist relations of production determine the form itself of the capitalist state. They impose limits on the democracy of even the most democratic bourgeois states. And capitalist relations generate in actuality forms of state that are not democratic at all. The real state agent against which the Paris Commune revolted, for instance, was not a bourgeois democracy, but the Second Empire of Louis Bonaparte, born out of the destruction of the, quote, social republic, end quote, of 1848, and dominated by a massive state bureaucracy, entirely alienated from the people and allied with the speculating and corrupt giants of the bourgeoisie. This certainly was not a form of authority appropriate for any kind of emancipation. Any Democrat could see that this apparatus had to be, quote, smashed, end quote, and replaced by a new form of power. The originality of Marx's work lay in his analysis of what this new form would be, a form of state more democratic than any that had existed or could exist under bourgeois rule. What made this possible was that the social base of this society was to be no longer the exploitation of the majority by the minority, but rather the dominance of the mass of the people over the exploiting minority. It was crucial to discover the, quote, political form under which the economic emancipation of labor could be accomplished, end quote. This meant not dreaming up an ideal form in the manner of utopians, nor dismissing the whole question of form in the manner of anti-authoritarians, nor posing republican forms as a limit which should not be overstepped. Rather, it called for an analysis of the dynamics of capitalist societies and of socialist revolutions. Although Marx and Engels only initiated this process in their theoretical and political writings, they were able, on the basis of their limited experience, to draw tentative conclusions about what particular forms of authority were appropriate. The rise and fall of the Paris Commune, which Marx saw as a prologue, a, quote, glorious harbinger, end quote, of a socialist form of authority, provided him with one occasion for giving empirical substance to his theoretical ideas. He tried to draw lessons, first from what it did, and second from what it would have done if it had survived. The principle which Marx saw embodied in the Commune was that of a transition from a, quote, special power, end quote, alienated from the people, to a power under their control, from a power which sought to monopolize political life to a power which opened political life up to the people. The, quote, haughtiest masters, end quote, of the people were to be replaced by the people's, quote, removable servants, end quote. Quote, mock responsibility, end quote, was to give way to, quote, real responsibility, end quote. The Commune represented, in Marx's eyes, quote, the reabsorption of the state power by society as its own living force, instead of as forces controlling and subduing it, end quote. Radical democracy was the Commune's keynote. The extension of representation from parliament to the bureaucracy, the judiciary and the army, universalization of suffrage, though Marx was silent on the age of majority, strict accountability of delegates to their electors, and revocability at short notice, abolition of the division of powers between legislature and executive in favor of legislative dominance, abolition of internal hierarchies within the state officialdom, popular organization independent of the state, replacement of the army by the, quote, people armed, end quote. Marx conceived of the Commune as itself a transitory form of power through the gradual extension of democratic controls over the state and of popular organization outside the state. Marx was very vague about what form this would take. The independence of the state from society would be gradually dissolved. The end point of the process was the withering away of the state. The final realization of the general will could be achieved, not through the state, but through the state's abolition. The extreme pole of democracy lay not in a particular form of state power, but in a form of power which transcended the state. What was the place of law in this scenario? It is clear from our discussion above that Marx saw a place for law right up to the final dissolution of the state. Even in the most advanced stages of the transition, law would still be needed to enforce relations of equivalence. Both its form and its content would be radically transformed. Marx, however, offered only hints concerning how they would be transformed. The judiciary, whose complete independence from the executive he supported in the 1850s, quote, were to be divested of that sham independence which has but served to mask their abject subserviency to all succeeding governments, end quote, and were to be made truly independent by being made, quote, elective, responsible, and revocable, end quote. The commune, Marx foresaw, quote, would have transformed the peasant's present bloodsuckers, the notary, advocate, executor, and other judicial vampires into salaried communal agents, end quote. Hal Draper points out that Marx's views seem to be that judicial functions were not to be subordinated to the commune, and that in this respect, Marx recognized the validity of a separation of powers. Marx saw in the law a means of inhibiting the power of government and of protecting the rights of the people, but it was not just as an instrument that Marx valued the law. The principle of the rational state which he inherited from Hegel was that of a synthesis between the universal will of the whole and the particular will of the individual. In the manuscripts, for example, Marx had rejected the crude communism which, quote, negates the personality of man in every sphere, extends the category of worker to all men, and returns to the unnatural simplicity of the poor, unrefined man who has no needs and who has not even reached the state of private property, let alone gone beyond the state of private property. End quote. In the German ideology, Marx's objection the fucking recorder crapped out on me, and so I have to reread a couple pages. So I apologize if I try to just fucking plow through this last bit. In the German ideology, Marx's objection to capitalist productive relations is that, quote, never in any earlier period have they taken on a form so indifferent to the intercourse of individuals as individuals, end quote. And his idea of communism, quote, corresponds to the development of individuals into complete individuals, end quote. The commune, Marx wrote, quote, wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production, land, and capital, now chiefly the means of enslaving and exploiting labor, into mere instruments of free and associated labor, end quote. Communism meant not the subordination of the individual to the collective, but rather the realization of the individual through the collective and the realization of the collective through the individual. A genuine synthesis between the universal and the particular was to be achieved, not a fake synthesis which really meant either the subordination of the individual to the state or the subordination of the state to private interest. Marx was for the development, expression, and realization of the individual as an individual, not for the suppression of individuality by the state. His objection to capitalism lay not in its, quote, individualism, end quote, but in the limits of its individualism. On the one hand, the bourgeoisie, quote, raises, quote, the rights of the individual, end quote, as its slogan. On the other, it suppresses individuality under the weight of the police, of bureaucracy, of hierarchy, and most especially of homogeneous and soul-destroying labor, to which it subjects most of the people. The individualism proclaimed by the bourgeoisie was not its fault, but its strength. The suppression of individuality, however, was the dark side of the capitalist coin. It was not, therefore, a question of subordinating individual right to the general good, but rather the extension of individual right beyond the narrow horizons of bourgeois right. Form and content must be changed. The right of the capitalist to exploit and of the bureaucracy to oppress the mass of the population was to be abolished, but this signified not the abolition but the enlargement of individual right. Law was not just an instrument, but a principle of socialist transition. The reader may remember that Hobbes demolished the idea of natural right by taking the idea of natural right to its limit. By extending it to mean the right of all to everything, natural right perished by its own abundance. With private property serving as his premise, Hobbes saw in the limitless extension of natural right a specter to be suppressed by the state. Marx, with human emancipation as his premise, saw in the limitless extension of right a path to genuine communism. It was through the combined extension of democracy and law that a real synthesis of the universal and the particular could be achieved. Was this a utopia? Are the state and the rule of law necessary properties of any complex democratic society? To answer this, it is necessary to see what the doctrine of the withering away of the state did not mean. First, it was not the same as the anarchist dream of abolition of all authority in the name of the limitless freedom of the individual. Expressed here in Marx's view was the mythology of petty bourgeois commodity production in the form of unbounded egoism. The abolition of state authority and the abolition of authority in general are not the same. The final goal of Marx and that of the anarchists were not identical. Second, the withering away of the state did not mean the end of public functions. In any society, there are communal tasks to be done: adjudication of disputes, internal regulation, general planning, external defense, if the society has foes beyond its borders, the organization of production and distribution, and so forth. In the Commune, some public functions immediately diminished. Quote, the Commune made that catchword of bourgeois revolutions, cheap government, a reality by destroying the two greatest sources of expenditure, the standing army and state functionaries, end quote. Though it could perhaps have made government cheaper, still if it had expropriated the national bank. The function of policing was also diminished in the Commune. Quote, no more corpses at the morgue, no nocturnal burglaries, scarcely any robberies. In fact, for the first time since the days of February 1848, the streets of Paris were safe, and that without any police of any kind, end quote. The function of policing, to the extent that it was still necessary, was performed by the popular militia. Third, the withering away of the state did not mean the dissolution of a division of labor for the performance of communal functions. The allocation of communal tasks to particular tasks was still necessary, though now it took the form not of hierarchical investiture, but of universal suffrage. Quote, universal suffrage was to serve the people, constituted in communes, as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for workmen and managers in his business, and it is well known that companies, like individuals in matters of real business, generally know how to put the right man in the right job, end quote. What the withering of the state did mean was the distribution What the withering away of the state did mean was the dissolution of an alien force, separated from the people, constituting an independent branch of the division of labor. It was the social form of the state that Marx saw as surpassable, not its technical functions. Quote, right, end quote, Marx argued in another much-cited passage from Critique of the Gotha program, quote, can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby, end quote. The narrow horizons of bourgeois right and democracy derive from the material conditions of capitalist production. The exploitation of the majority by the minority is compatible only with limited democracy and limited right. Similarly, the surpassing of these limits cannot be achieved by an act of will alone, but itself depends on definite material conditions. On the edges of Marx's analysis of the Commune, a separate problem was emerging: the relation between democratic forms of government and the practical needs of the revolution. The Commune was on the one hand, quote, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor, end quote, and on the other, quote, a working-class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, end quote. The form of the Commune was radical democracy. Its content was the rule of labor over capital. No automatic synthesis between form and content could be presupposed. The Commune was, after all, rapidly defeated. The communards of Paris horribly massacred at the vengeful hands of the Thiers mercenaries, supported by the bourgeoisie under the flag of, quote, order and justice, end quote. Was the democratic form of the commune incompatible with its success? Marx argued on the periphery of his celebration of the commune that the commune was insufficiently resolute in, quote, smashing, end quote, the old bureaucratic military machine. They should have marched at once on Versailles, but missed their opportunity, quote, because of moral scruples, end quote. The Central Committee surrendered its power too soon to the commune, quote, again from too, quote, honorable, end quote, scrupulosity. End quote. Would the commune, Marx asked, quote, not have shamefully betrayed its trust by affecting to keep up all the decencies and appearances of liberalism as in a time of profound peace, end quote. There was a real tension emerging from the material conditions of the commune's existence, between the commune's success as an organ of class rule and its success as a prefigurative form of socialist government. For instance, the failure of the communards to take decisive military action against Thiers' regrouping forces at Versailles was linked to the fact that they organized elections in Paris instead. In theory, perhaps, they could do both. In practice, they could either send their best forces out to fight or use those forces at home to organize elections. They could not do both. This failure was linked to the fact that their commitment to liberal principles of free speech, free assembly, free criticism of government allowed the commune's enemies to regroup in Paris and would have made it very difficult to send the flowers of the commune's youth out of the city to fight. It was linked to the fact that the precipitate transfer of power from the Central Committee to the commune left the latter without the kind of audacious leadership capable of taking the initiative against Thiers. It was linked to the fact that, although the introduction of elections into the army allowed for the successful expulsion of officers committed to the bourgeoisie, this was not an adequate means of rapidly reconstructing an effective fighting force. This real tension between form and content, democracy and class struggle, was to impress itself on later Marxists looking back on the commune and attempting to draw from it lessons for their own struggles. Kautsky came down in favor of its democratic form, which he used to contrast with the Bolsheviks' dictatorship of the proletariat, and pretended that there was no conflict with its class content. Trotsky came down in favor of its class content and urged that the commune, like the Bolsheviks, had to forego temporarily their democratic principles in order to win and to survive. He had the merit of looking the issue square in the face, which Kautsky certainly did not. The immediate dilemmas confronting the commune were symptomatic of a larger tension between a, quote, fuller democracy, end quote, Lenin's phrase, as the political form of socialist government, and, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, described by Lenin as, quote, unrestricted power beyond law resting on force in the strictest sense of the word, end quote, as its class content. It seemed to me that Marx posed the problem, but by no means resolved the problem. Marx's vision of socialist forms of power was based on his knowledge of bourgeois revolutions, of bourgeois theories of power, of bourgeois forms of power, and finally on the first faltering attempts at socialist revolution. Marx did not provide a blueprint for the future, but he did draw a sketch of the principles of socialist power as he saw them. They are not complete nor static. They need to be filled out, expanded, and revised in the light of our experience. Forms of socialist power born out of developed monopoly capital in the, quote, West, and out of the state bureaucracy that passes for, quote, socialism in the, quote, East, cannot simply mirror the forms established by the commune. Perhaps there still lingered in Marx a touch of his old master. Was the Paris Commune to Marx what the Prussian monarchy was to Hegel, the embodiment of the idea of the rational state?